A woman raised her child alone for 7 years. A man ruled a London crime empire. They never stopped loving each other, but someone stole every letter, every chance they had to find each other again. And now, that person is ordering the murder of all three of them. If you want to know if love can survive betrayal, gunfire, and 8 years of forced silence, watch until the end of this episode. Like to support the channel, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has traveled around the world. The storm came in fast the way Pacific storms always do. No warning, just a wall of gray rolling off the water and swallowing the coast whole. 1 minute the fishing boats were visible from the diner windows, orange hulls bobbing against a pewter sky. The next, they were gone, swallowed into the gray like they'd never existed at all. Mara Ellison didn't look up. She was refilling the salt shakers at table 4, a task she'd done so many times her hands moved without her. The diner smelled the way it always smelled. Coffee burned at the bottom of the pot. Fry oil worked past its prime. The faint brine of the harbor threading through every crack in the walls. Seaview Diner. The name was optimistic. The view was a parking lot and a bait shop. Mara, Dennis called it from behind the pass-through. He was 53 years old, built like a man who'd spent 30 of those years loading freight, and he spoke to everyone in the same tone, flat, not unkind. Table 7 needs their check. I know, she said. She didn't rush. Not out of laziness. Mara hadn't been lazy a day in her adult life, but because she'd learned that rushing in this place only meant you made mistakes, and mistakes cost you, and she couldn't afford to be cost anything right now. She capped the salt shaker, moved to the next, kept her breathing even. Outside, the rain hit the windows sideways. Table 7 was 2 retired halibut fishermen who came in every Thursday regardless of weather, ordered the same thing, black coffee, eggs over hard, sourdough toast, and tipped $4 regardless of service. She liked them. They didn't ask her questions. They talked to each other about the boats and left her alone, and there was a specific kind of peace in that. She dropped the check between their coffee cups without a word. The one with the white beard nodded at her. She nodded back. She was heading toward the kitchen when the front door banged open. Wind, rain, and Noah. He came through the door like a projectile, sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, backpack swinging off one shoulder, his whole body already mid-sentence before the door finished closing behind him. Mom, Tyler said I could have his lunch card if he could borrow my Pokemon binder, but I said no because last time he borrowed something Boots, Mara said. He stopped, looked down at his sneakers, which were leaving wet prints across the clean floor. He towed them off without bending down, the way children do, and kicked them toward the mat by the door. Last time he borrowed something, he lost it, he finished. Did you eat lunch today? Yes. What did you eat? A pause. The kind that meant he was calculating how much truth was strategically necessary. Half a sandwich and some chips. Mara looked at him. He looked back at her with his father's eyes. She didn't let herself think it that way usually, but sometimes it hit her like a physical thing, the steel blue of them, the particular steadiness. Noah was 7, but he had a gaze that made adults feel like they were the ones being evaluated. There's a grilled cheese in the back, she said. Dennis already made it. Go sit in the booth by the kitchen and do your homework. He opened his mouth. After the grilled cheese, she said. He went. She watched him go and then turned back to the floor and kept moving, because that was the only way she knew how to do this. Keep moving. Don't let the weight of it settle. Don't look at the water out the window and think about what it would feel like to have a day with nothing to do. She was 29 years old, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The diner emptied out around 4, the way it always did in the shoulder season. October on the Oregon coast meant the summer tourists were gone and the locals were hunkered in. Dennis went to do the books. The cook left at 4:30. Mara wiped tables and thought about the electric bill and whether Noah's rain jacket from last year still fit him, or whether she needed to find $5 somewhere in the next 2 weeks to replace it. That was when the black SUV pulled into the lot. She noticed it the way she noticed anything, sidelong, not making a thing of it, just a flicker of information filed and held. Oregon plates. Clean. Too clean for this parking lot, which was mostly salt-rusted pickups and 10-year-old Subarus. The SUV sat in the far corner with its engine running for a few minutes, and then the engine cut and nobody got out. Mara finished the tables. She went to the back and checked on Noah, who had eaten half the grilled cheese and was drawing horses in the margin of his math worksheet. She decided that was close enough to homework. By the time she came back out front, the SUV was gone. She didn't think about it again. There were too many other things to think about. 3 days passed. The storm broke, and the coast went back to the flat gray calm that defined it for 9 months of the year. Mara worked her double shifts on Tuesday through Saturday, opening at 6, staying until whoever covered the dinner service showed up, which was often late. She picked Noah up from school, fed him, supervised what passed for homework, and put him to bed by 9. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the apartment above the hardware store 2 blocks from the harbor and looked at her bills and calculated, the same calculation she'd been doing for 7 years, and went to bed and did it again. It was a life. She'd made it herself, out of necessity and stubbornness and the particular refusal to need help that she'd developed so thoroughly it had become structural, part of her skeleton. She told herself she didn't miss anything. Most days she believed it. The second black SUV appeared on Thursday, different plates this time. Washington State. It was parked across the street from the diner's front window, just past the bait shop, engine off. It was there when she arrived at 6, and it was still there when the lunch rush peaked at noon. She watched it while she refilled the coffee station, not staring, just aware. Nobody came in. "Dennis," she said when she passed the pass-through. That SUV across the street been there before?" He looked. He had the particular lack of curiosity of a man who had decided long ago not to notice things that weren't directly his problem. "Don't think so." She let it go. But she moved through the rest of her shift feeling slightly off-center, like a wheel slightly out of alignment, functional but not quite right. It was still there when school let out, when Noah came in his usual way, door bang, wet shoes, ongoing monologue, and she felt the immediate recalibration that happened every time she saw him, the way everything else became slightly less urgent. She shepherded him toward the kitchen booth and cut the grilled cheese into triangles the way he liked and tried to let the SUV go. She couldn't. "Noah," she said, "I need you to stay in the back today, okay? Don't go near the front windows." He looked up from the cheese. "Why?" "Just for today." He studied her face with those steel blue eyes, 7 years old, already too good at reading her. "Are you worried about something?" "I'm always worried about something. That's what moms do. Eat your sandwich." He ate his sandwich, watching her. Ted. The man who caused all of it was sitting in a rented suite at a hotel 40 minutes up the coast. His name was Damien Ashcroft, though he was currently operating under the name David Carver, which was clean, well-documented, and would pass any reasonable scrutiny. The suite cost $800 a night, which was not a concern. He'd flown into Portland 4 days ago on the final leg of a negotiation that had taken 3 months in 2 other countries to reach this point. The Hargrove family, who controlled the Western Seaboard's pharmaceutical import network, wanted a distribution arrangement that would move British product through Oregon's coastal port infrastructure. It was worth $40 million a year, conservatively, if the arrangement held. Damien had flown across the Atlantic to close it personally because there were certain deals you couldn't delegate. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. Reading rooms, reading people, knowing exactly when to speak and when to let silence do the work. He'd built an organization that stretched across 4 cities from a single contact his father had left him at 19, and he'd done it through a combination of ruthlessness and a very particular kind of patience that most people in his world mistook for coldness. He sat at the desk by the window with the Hargrove documents in front of him, and he wasn't reading them. He was looking at the photograph his investigator had sent 2 hours ago. It was low resolution, taken from distance. His investigator was good, but not reckless. The photograph showed a woman walking down a harbor street with a child. The child was wearing a blue raincoat and carrying a backpack shaped like a dinosaur. The woman had dark hair pulled back. The photograph was taken from behind, so he couldn't see her face. He didn't need to see her face. He needed to see the child's face, and the photograph before this one, taken 48 hours ago, near the school, had given him that. The child's face was clear in that one. Crystal clear. Looking straight at the camera, the way children sometimes do when they sense something some instinct firing before the conscious mind catches up. Steel blue eyes, the particular set of the jaw, the way the light caught the angle of the cheekbone. Damien had looked at that photograph for a very long time. Then he'd called his investigator. "How old?" he said. 7, said the investigator, whose name was Caro and who had been with him for 11 years. 7 and 2 months. Damien had done the arithmetic. He had done it 3 times in the first 30 seconds, and 3 more times after that, and the answer was always the same. He put the photograph down on the desk and stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the ocean was doing what the Pacific always did, making everything else feel small, relentless, and gray, and utterly indifferent. He stood there for a long time. "I want everything," he said finally, "from the beginning, every piece of her life since she came here. Employment, finances, associates, the boys' school records, medical records if you can get them." A pause. "And I want to know who else has been watching her." Because they had been. He'd known it from Caro's first report. The description of a second surveillance vehicle, different plates, different positioning. Not his, someone else's. That was the part that concerned him. They had been in each other's orbit for 8 years. That was how Damien thought of it now. Orbit, the way objects in space circle without touching, defined entirely by their relationship to something they can't reach. He'd been 23 in Edinburgh, not yet what he was now. The architecture of his life was already being built, the contacts and leverage and careful violence, but he was still young enough to believe he could keep parts of himself separate. He'd met Mara at a gallery opening he'd attended for reasons that had nothing to do with art. She'd been there with a university friend, dressed badly for the weather in a thin jacket, and she'd been looking at a print of the Oregon coast, some photographer's vision of it, all gray water and dark rock, with an expression of such uncomplicated longing that he'd stopped. He didn't usually stop for things. 3 weeks. That was all it had been, technically. 3 weeks in which he'd been present in Edinburgh when he should have been in Manchester or Antwerp, and he hadn't fully understood why until he'd already left, until he was sitting on a plane back to London and felt the specific weight of something he'd walked away from. He'd told himself it was better that way. He was 23 years old and building something that would require a great deal of harm to a great deal of people, and there was no version of that future in which someone like Mara was safe. He told himself this. He believed it. He had not expected letters. The first one arrived 3 months after Edinburgh, forwarded through one of his cleaner addresses. He almost didn't open it. He did open it, and then he sat very still for a while, and then he wrote back, careful, brief, discouraging, but not unkind, and told himself that would be the end of it. More letters came, and then, after a while, they stopped. He'd assumed she'd moved on. He told himself that was the right outcome. He'd folded it away into the architecture of his life as a closed room and kept building. Now he stood at the window of his $800 suite on the Oregon coast, looking at an ocean she'd driven across a continent to be near. And he understood for the first time that the letter stopping hadn't meant she'd given up. It had meant something else entirely. Caro came to the suite at 9 that evening with a tablet and a manila folder. She came to America 2 months after Edinburgh, Caro said. He was a lean man, 50-ish, with the permanent expression of someone waiting for bad news to become official. Oregon coast. Her mother had a connection to this harbor town from years back, an aunt who owned property here. The aunt died, left her a small inheritance. She used it to pay first and last on the apartment. Damien was sitting with the folder open on the desk, not touching the contents yet. How long before the boy was born? 7 months after she arrived. He did the arithmetic again, same answer. She had him alone, Caro continued, no partner documented. She listed the father as unknown on the birth record. He paused, and Damien could hear the precision with which Caro was choosing his next words. She was 22 years old and living in a town where she knew no one, with no income except waitressing, and she listed the father as unknown. Because she didn't know how to reach me, Damien said. It wasn't a question. Sir? Caro set the tablet on the desk. On the screen was a scan, a letter, handwritten, the handwriting familiar even in digital reproduction, even 8 years later. My investigator found these through a contact at your London office. Former administrative staff. There are 11 of them, spanning a period of approximately 4 months after Edinburgh, addressed to you. Never delivered. Damien looked at the screen. He didn't move. The last one, Caro said, was written approximately 3 weeks before she would have been visibly pregnant. 11 letters, 4 months. She'd written 11 letters across 4 months, and every one of them had disappeared inside his organization before reaching him. He thought about the logistics of that. Someone with enough access, enough positioning, enough motivation to intercept correspondence that came through an administrative channel most of his staff didn't even know existed. Who? He said. I don't have a name yet. The former administrative contact who found these has since been moved out of the country. I don't know by who, but the timing is recent. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. Which meant that whoever had buried those letters for 8 years had just become aware that someone was looking. Damien closed the folder. He sat very still. Outside, the ocean moved in the dark. She doesn't know who I am, he said. No, sir. She has no idea. To the best of my investigator's knowledge, she's never made any connection between the man she knew in Edinburgh and any of your current activities. And the boy? He knows nothing. He's 7. Damien was quiet for a moment, then, the second surveillance. Have you identified the vehicles? Caro's expression shifted slightly. The first trace of something that wasn't quite neutral. The plates traced to a shell company registered in Nevada. The company has one other connection in its registration history. He stopped. Tell me. Marcus Webb. The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. A single point of impact, then the circles spreading out. Marcus Webb was Damien's second in command, had been for 6 years. He managed the London infrastructure, the logistics, the movement of money through the organization's more legitimate facades. He was trusted in the way that only someone who has been present through enough shared violence could be trusted. Not with affection, exactly, but with the specific confidence of mutual risk. Damien looked at the folder on the desk. He's here, he said. His travel documents show him in London, Caro said carefully. But the most recent shell company activity, he's here, Damien stood. Or he has people here, which is the same thing. He moved to the window again, the ocean again, the dark water. He intercepted those letters. 8 years ago, when I was 23, someone in my organization buried 11 letters from a woman in Edinburgh because they didn't want me distracted, or because they wanted to position themselves as indispensable while I was young enough to be shaped. He paused. Webb has been with me since I was 24. Yes, sir. So whatever he thought he was protecting 8 years ago, or whatever he thought he was building, he's been protecting it long enough to panic when something moves. The shell company's surveillance on the woman began 3 days after your flight to Portland was booked. Damien turned from the window. He's not watching her because of her. He's watching her because of me. He picked up the folder. If he's established she's connected to me. If he's found the boy, he may have found the boy, Caro said quietly. The surveillance began before your investigator documented the resemblance. Webb would have had access to the same Edinburgh files. Damien set down the folder. He stood in the center of the room and let himself feel, for exactly 3 seconds, the full weight of what 8 years of intercepted letters had cost. The boy growing up without a father, the woman who'd driven across a continent and made herself a life and listed the father as unknown because she'd had no other choice. The architecture of a betrayal so patient it had mistaken itself for loyalty. 3 seconds. Then he put it away. I need you to move the Hargrove meetings, he said. Push everything 2 weeks. The Hargroves won't push them. He was already moving toward the closet where he kept his operational kit, the things that traveled under a different name than David Carver, in a bag that had never been on any airline manifest. And I need a car. Something that doesn't match what Webb's people are used to seeing. What are you doing? Damien pulled on his jacket. I'm going to the diner. Caro said nothing for a moment. Then, Sir, if Webb has established her connection to you, and if he's moved surveillance assets here, any approach you make directly to her could, I know what it could do. He picked up the bag. I'm not going to approach her. I'm going to sit in her parking lot and watch who else is watching her. He paused at the door. and then I'm going to figure out exactly how long I have before Marcus Webb decides that the cleanest solution to his problem is to make sure there's nobody left who can connect him to anything. He opened the door. "Call me if any of those vehicles move," he said, and walked out into the dark. Mara was counting her tips at the end of her shift when Noah came out from the kitchen booth and said the SUV was back. She went still. "Which window?" she said. Her voice was level. She'd learned that trick years ago. Your voice stays level. The fear stays behind your ribs where it belongs. You function. "Front." Across the street. She crossed to the front window carefully, staying to the side of the glass. The bait shop's security light reached about halfway across the street, and in that half-light she could see the dark shape of the SUV parked at the far edge of it. Engine off. No visible movement inside, same position as before. Always the same position, where you could see the diner's entrance but not easily be seen from the diner's interior. She felt her breathing change without her permission. "Noah." She didn't look away from the window. "Go get your backpack and your boots. We're leaving through the kitchen." But now, quietly, she heard him move. She heard the particular silence of a 7-year-old obeying without asking more questions, which meant he understood something was wrong, which she hated, which she couldn't fix right now. She pulled her phone out of her apron pocket. Dennis had already gone. She was alone in the diner. She thought about calling the police. She thought about what she would say. There's a car parked across the street. It's been there before. She thought about the look of a cop who'd been given a call about a legally parked vehicle on a public street. She thought about how long that would take, and she thought about the kitchen door, and she thought about Noah's boots. She texted Dennis instead. "Something feels off, taking Noah out the back. Can you check on the diner in the morning?" Then she went to the kitchen. Noah had his backpack on and his boots in his hands. He was looking at her with the steady, measuring look that still sometimes stopped her cold. The way it had appeared in him so early, that particular quality of attention, nothing like her own tendency to panic and then act, nothing like anything she'd grown up with. "Put your boots on," she said. "Don't run until I say." He put his boots on. They went out the kitchen door into the back alley, into the rain and the dark and the smell of the harbor, and Mara kept her hand on her son's shoulder and told herself it was nothing. A car. A coincidence. Small-town paranoia and too many long shifts and not enough sleep. She almost believed it. She would not have believed it at all if she'd turned around as they reached the end of the alley, if she'd looked back past the diner to the street beyond, where, in the shadow of a parked delivery truck, a second figure stood watching the black SUV with the same careful stillness with which the SUV was watching the diner. A tall man, dark jacket, not moving, watching the watchers. The apartment above the hardware store had 3 rooms and a bathroom with a window that didn't lock properly, and Mara had lived in it for 6 years with the particular acceptance of someone who has stopped expecting things to improve and started expecting them simply to continue. The radiator knocked in cold weather. The kitchen faucet dripped. The stairs creaked on the 4th and 7th step, which she'd learned to use as an alarm system. She knew which sounds belonged to the building and which didn't, the way you learn any place you've survived in long enough. She sat at the kitchen table at 11:15 that night with the lights on and her phone face up in front of her and listened to Noah breathing through the wall. He'd gone down fast. He usually did, once she got him settled. Noah slept the way he did most things, completely, with a kind of focused commitment that made her proud and ached at the same time. She'd checked the door lock twice. She'd stood at the window and looked at the street below for a long time and seen nothing except the ordinary dark of a harbor town after 10, the sodium light on wet pavement, a cat moving along the far curb. She made herself a cup of tea and didn't drink it. The thing about fear, real fear, not the ambient dread of bills and time and the creeping sense that you were running out of both, was that it had a taste. Metallic. Sitting at the back of the throat. She'd first learned that taste in her early 20s, in a situation she'd spent years carefully not thinking about, and she could feel it now, sitting in her kitchen, telling herself it was nothing. A car, parked legally on a public street, but 3 times. 3 different days. And those were only the times she'd noticed. She pulled her phone toward her and opened the browser and sat there with the screen glowing and her tea cooling, and she thought about what she knew, which was almost nothing. Stranger in a good car, watching the diner. That was it. That was the entire inventory. She closed the browser. Then she opened it again and typed, "How to tell if you are being watched." She stared at the search results for a moment, feeling faintly ridiculous, and then closed the phone entirely and pushed it away. She was tired. She was overthinking. She had a double shift in 7 hours. She went to bed and lay there in the dark and listened to the rain on the window and the knock of the radiator and Noah's breathing through the wall, and she did not sleep for a very long time. Damien was back at the hotel by midnight. He'd stood in the dark beside that delivery truck for 40 minutes, watching the SUV, watching the diner, watching the back alley where Mara and the boy had disappeared. He'd watched two men in the SUV wait for another 20 minutes after the kitchen light went dark, and then the engine turned over and the vehicle left, heading north on the coast road. He'd memorized the plates, the same Washington plates as before, and then he'd stood in the rain a while longer, processing the specific geometry of what he was looking at. Webb's people weren't moving on her yet. They were watching her, documenting, building a picture, which meant Webb was still in the calculation phase, which meant Damien had time, but not much of it, because men like Marcus Webb only stayed in the calculation phase as long as the math was unclear. Once it clarified, once Webb determined that Damien had located the woman and the boy, once he understood what Damien intended, the calculation would resolve very quickly in the direction of the cleanest solution. Damien had worked with Webb long enough to know how his mind operated. Caro was awake when he got back. He was sitting at the sweet small table with his laptop and a cup of something that had gone cold, and he looked up when Damien came in and read his face with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been doing it for 11 years. "You confirmed it," Caro said. "Two men in the vehicle. Neither of them I've seen before, which means Webb's using contracted surveillance rather than our own people. He's being careful." Damien took off the jacket and dropped it. He doesn't want anyone in the organization to know he has eyes on her, because anyone who knew would wonder why. "Yes." Bonnie Caro closed the laptop. "What do you want to do?" Damien sat down. He looked at the folder on the desk. The one with Caro's briefing, the scanned letters, the photograph of a boy with steel blue eyes. He thought about what he was about to do and whether it was, in any measurable sense, the right decision, or whether it was simply the only one he was capable of making. "I want to meet her," he said. Caro was quiet. "Not tonight," Damien said. "Not in a way that looks like a confrontation. She needs to see me somewhere she has control, her environment, her schedule. And she needs to see me before Webb's people decide the surveillance phase is over. If she sees you and recognizes you, she will recognize me." Another silence. Caro had the folder of letters on the table now, and he put his hand on it without opening it. "Sir, if she reacts badly in a public space, she won't make a scene." Damien said it with a certainty that was not arrogance. It was simply that he had known her, however briefly, and there were things you understood about a person after 3 weeks in Edinburgh, in October, in a city that felt like the edge of the world. He knew she wouldn't make a scene. She would freeze, and then she would go very still, and then she would ask him questions in a low voice, and he would answer them, and it would be very controlled and very terrible. She'll want to understand what's happening before she decides what to do about it. Caro said nothing more about it. "Get some sleep," Damien said. "Tomorrow, I'm going to the diner." He went in the late morning, after the breakfast rush was gone, and before the lunch crowd arrived. The dead hour, the gap in the day when diners like this one had 3 or 4 tables occupied, and the staff had a moment to breathe. He drove himself in the nondescript rental, parked in the lot without ceremony, and went in. The bell above the door was a small sound. He registered it and the smell of the place. Burned coffee, fry oil, brine, and then he registered her. She was behind the counter, refilling napkin dispensers. Her back was to him. Dark hair pulled up the same way as in the photograph. Not styled, just managed, pinned back so it stayed out of her face while she worked. The same economy of movement he'd watched from a distance, and that up close confirmed itself as something more than efficiency. It was the movement of someone who'd learned to use exactly as much energy as a task required, and no more, because there was a specific and finite supply of it, and it had to last. He sat down at the counter. She turned around. The moment lasted approximately 4 seconds. during which neither of them spoke. Damien watched her face move through recognition, the delay, the recalibration, the specific quality of stillness that follows when your brain has produced a result your conscious mind refuses to accept. Then she set the napkin dispenser down on the counter very carefully and said, "What are you doing here?" Not a question. The absence of inflection was itself a kind of violence, controlled, deliberate, the voice of someone keeping a door shut with both hands. "I'd like some coffee," he said. "That's not what I asked you." He held her eyes. They were dark, with the kind of tiredness in them that goes bone deep and has been there long enough to stop reading as tiredness and start reading as just the way a person's eyes look. He'd thought about what she'd look like now in the years since Edinburgh. Not often, not indulgently, but the thought had come regardless, the way certain things do. He hadn't anticipated the exactness of his own reaction to her face, the way his chest went briefly and completely quiet. "I know," he said. "I'll explain. Can you give me a few minutes?" "You've been here before." She wasn't asking. "The SUVs. Those aren't mine." Something moved through her expression. Not quite alarm, but its immediate predecessor. She turned slightly, the way a person turns when they're calculating the distance to a door, and he saw it and said quickly, "Your son isn't here today." She went absolutely still. "He's in school," Damien said. "He's safe. I'm not saying it to frighten you. I'm telling you because you were about to start thinking about whether you could get to him faster than you could deal with me, and I don't want you thinking that. He's in school. He's fine." The stillness held another second and then broke, not into movement, but into a different quality of attention. She was looking at him now the way people look at things they haven't fully categorized yet, alert and wary and not yet decided. "How do you know where my son is?" she said. "Because I've been trying to understand the situation before I came to you." He kept his voice low and even. "I know it sounds like you've been watching me." Her voice was still low. Another customer at table 2 was working through a plate of eggs without looking up. The cook was visible through the pass-through, headphones in. She was choosing her register deliberately. This would not become a scene. "It sounds like you flew to Oregon and had someone follow me around and watch my son." "Yes," he said, "that's what happened." She breathed out through her nose. "Tell me why," she said. "Because 3 weeks after I arrived in Edinburgh, I left without explanation, and I've spent a long time telling myself that was the right decision, and 5 days ago I was walking out of a meeting 40 minutes up the coast, and your son ran into me on the sidewalk." He paused. "He has my eyes." The silence that followed had a different texture than the others. Mara stood behind the counter and looked at him. Her hands were flat on the counter surface, not gripping, not trembling, just resting there with the forced steadiness of conscious effort. He watched her chest rise and fall. He watched her jaw set. "You don't have the right," she said, "to walk in here after 7 years and say something like that, like it's, 'I know.' Don't do that." Sharp. "Don't agree with me before I'm done. I'm not looking for easy." He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. "He's 7 years old," she said. "I had him alone. I raised him alone. I spent 4 months before he was born writing you letters, and not one of them—" She stopped herself. Something crossed her face and was controlled. Not one of them got a response. Something shifted in Damien's chest. "How many letters?" he said. She looked at him oddly. "What? How many letters did you write?" Her eyes narrowed. "What does that have to do with, please, how many?" The word please seemed to catch her off guard. Not the word itself, but the way he said it, the specific absence of anything performative in it. She studied him. 11, she said. "Over about 4 months. Why?" He reached into his jacket pocket and set the tablet on the counter between them, screen up. The scanned image of the first letter was visible. Her handwriting, her words, addressed to him. He watched her look at it. "Where did you get that?" she said. Her voice had gone quiet in a different way. "My investigator found them. All 11. They were intercepted before they ever reached me. Someone inside my organization made sure I never saw them." He watched her face. "I didn't know about the pregnancy. I didn't know about Noah. I have been sitting in a hotel room for 4 days looking at those letters and trying to understand what was done to us. The word us landed in the space between them, and neither of them acknowledged it, and it stayed there anyway. Mara looked at the tablet. She looked at her own handwriting, her 22-year-old self's careful cursive, the slant of it slightly different from how she wrote now. She looked at it for a long time. "Someone in your organization," she said finally. "Yes." "And those SUVs?" "Also connected." He didn't look away from her face. "Someone who's been watching you since I booked my flight to Portland. Someone who knows, or suspects, that I found you." "Why would someone in your organization care about—" She stopped, started again. "What are you, exactly? You told me in Edinburgh you were an import-export. That was true, in a general sense." "Don't," she said again, the same word as before, the same edge. He held her eyes. "I run an organization," he said, "in London. It operates in spaces that aren't entirely legal. The person who intercepted your letters is someone who has been positioned inside that organization for a very long time, and if he's established the connection between us, between me and Noah, then you are not safe here. That's what I came to tell you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Get out of my diner," she said. "Mara, I need you to leave. Right now." Her voice was exactly level. "I need to think, and I can't think with you sitting there, and if you actually want to help me, then you'll give me 2 hours." He looked at her. He thought about the SUV. He thought about the calculation phase and how long it lasted. 2 hours, he said. "Then I need to see you again." "I'll find you," she said. "Don't come back here." He stood, put the tablet back in his pocket, and walked out. The bell above the door was the same small sound. Whomped. She didn't move for 5 minutes after he left. She stood behind the counter with her hands flat on the surface and breathed, and the customer at table 2 finished his eggs and left a 10 on the table and walked out without speaking, and the cook changed whatever was playing through his headphones, and the harbor outside went on being gray and damp and indifferent. Then she went to the back and sat in the kitchen booth. Noah's booth, the one with the cracked vinyl and the names of previous children scratched faintly into the table edge. And she put her face in her hands. 11 letters. She had sat in a one-room flat in Edinburgh in the weeks before she left for America, knowing she was pregnant, terrified, and furious, and still, she hadn't been able to stop herself. She'd hated herself for it. Still hoping he would respond. Still writing, because writing was the only thing that felt like doing something. She had written 11 letters over 4 months, and then she had run out of address options, and run out of money, and run out of the particular kind of hope that keeps you writing letters to someone who isn't answering, and she had gotten on a plane. She had spent 7 years believing he had chosen not to answer. She sat in the kitchen booth and looked at the scratched names in the table and understood, for the first time, the specific shape of what had been done to her. Not abandonment. Something worse. Engineered absence. Someone had decided, had calculated, had chosen that she and her letters and whatever she was to Damien Ashcroft were a problem that needed removing, and they had removed them, quietly and completely, and then watched while she spent 7 years building a life out of the debris. The fury that moved through her then was not the hot kind. It was the cold kind, the slow kind, the kind that settles into the foundation of things. She picked up her phone. Dennis answered on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying the mild suspicion of a man who recognized a non-emergency call that nonetheless required something from him. "You're not calling in sick." "I need the rest of today," she said. "I'll cover your Saturday." A pause. "You okay?" "I'll cover your Saturday," she said again. "Fine. Carla can finish." She hung up. She sat another minute, then she called the school, confirmed Noah was there and accounted for, and told them she'd be picking him up early. 2 o'clock, she'd be at the front. The secretary noted it without comment. She had until 2. She went back out into the diner, got her coat, told Carla, who was arriving for her afternoon shift with the particular energy of someone who did not want to talk before 2 p.m., that she was leaving early, and walked out into the gray. She found Damien's hotel by the straightforward method of walking up the coast road until she found the only establishment in a 10-mile stretch that would charge the rates his suit implied. It was called the Harbor View, and it was the nicest thing within 40 minutes in any direction, which was still only a notch above average. The Oregon coast did not run to luxury. She stood in the lobby and called the front desk from her cell and asked for David Carver's room, because she had noticed, when he was at the counter, that the card he'd been about to produce from his wallet had that name on it. She was observant. She'd always been observant. It was how she'd survived. He answered the room phone on the first ring. "Lobby," she said, and hung up. He came down in 4 minutes. He was wearing a different jacket, less constructed than the morning's, more like something a person actually wore rather than presented in. She was standing by the window that looked out at the parking lot and the gray strip of ocean beyond it, and she turned when she heard the elevator. They found a pair of chairs in the corner of the lobby, away from the front desk and the one other guest who was checking in. Not private, but adequate. "Tell me about the person who took the letters," she said. No preamble. "His name is Marcus Webb. He's been my second in command for 6 years. He was with the organization before I had full control of it, in a junior capacity. He would have been present when I returned from Edinburgh. He would have known I'd been gone longer than the work required." He paused. "He's careful, intelligent. He spent 6 years making himself difficult to remove." "Why would he care about your personal life enough to intercept letters from a woman in Scotland?" "Because I was 23 and still building the organization, and someone with enough foresight would understand that an attachment, a child, a family, changes a person's calculus, changes what they're willing to risk, changes who they're protecting." He looked at her steadily. He may have believed he was acting in the organization's interests, or he may have been acting in his own, keeping me unencumbered, keeping me dependent on the structure around me. A pause. "Both things can be true." Mara looked at him. She had spent the hour's walk processing the shape of this, and she had arrived at the same place she always arrived when faced with complicated situations. Not at the emotion, which she would deal with later, but at the practical questions. "Why is he watching me now?" she said. "Because he knows I'm here. My flight was booked under my own name. He still has access to my administrative infrastructure. He'll have known I was coming to Oregon within hours of the booking." He shifted slightly. "He doesn't know what I know yet. He knows I'm here, he knows I was in this region, and he knows there was some reason. He may not have identified the specific reason yet. But if his people have been watching you closely enough, they'll have documented me going into the diner this morning." The weight of that settled. "So now he knows," she said. "He will, yes, within hours, if not already. And then his calculation changes." Damien looked at her and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps, or questions that required more reassurance. Instead, she was moving through the logic of it the way he would have, the same dry progression from point to point. "Yes," he said, "his calculation changes." "What does he do when his calculation changes?" "He removes the problem," Damien said. "That's how he's always operated, not impulsively. He's patient. He plans. But once he decides something needs to end, he ends it." A pause. "You and Noah represent a loose end that's been unmanaged for 8 years. If he now understands that I've found you, that I know what he did, we become more than a loose end," Mara said. "Yes." She sat with that. Outside the window, the gray ocean moved. She thought about Noah at school, sitting in his classroom with the dinosaur backpack on the hook by the door, doing math problems or drawing horses in the margins. She thought about him coming home to the apartment with the stuck bathroom window and the creaking stairs, and the specific radius of the world she'd built around him, and what it would mean to have that radius become unsafe. She thought about 7 years of a locked room that had just been opened and what was on the other side of the door. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Mara, I have a life here. Noah has a school. He has—" She stopped. "I'm not going to take him out of his life and run because someone in your organization is afraid of what I know. You don't know enough yet to be a real threat to him, but he doesn't know that." "Then tell him." Damien looked at her. "Call him," she said. "Tell him you've been here, you've seen me. It means nothing. It changes nothing. Buy some time." He won't believe it. Do it anyway. It buys time, and time is what we need. She held his eyes. While you're buying time, I want the letters. I already gave you, not scans, the real ones. And anything else your investigator found. Documents, financial records, anything that shows what Webb did and when. She looked at him steadily. If he's going to come after me and my son because of something he did 8 years ago, I want to know exactly what I'm holding in my hands before he tries to take it away from me. Damien was quiet for a moment. Outside, the other hotel guest had finished checking in, and the lobby was entirely still. He looked at Mara Ellison, 29 years old, sitting in a hotel lobby chair in her diner uniform, 7 years and a continent and an intercepted archive of grief between them. And he understood that whatever he'd been expecting from this conversation, it had not been this. Caro can have copies to you by tonight, he said. Good. She stood. I'll call you tomorrow morning. Don't come to the diner again. She picked up her coat. And don't have your people follow me home. I know where I live. She walked across the lobby and out into the gray. He sat in the chair and looked at the door for a while after it closed behind her. Caro met Damien in the elevator, which meant Caro had been in the lobby and had watched the conversation from a discreet position near the business center, because that was the kind of man Caro was. Well, Caro said, not now. She's going to be a complication. She's going to be necessary, Damien said. Webb's people are going to report that I made contact. We have maybe 48 hours before he decides he's out of the calculation phase. He looked at the numbers above the elevator door. Pull everything you have on Webb's current assets. I want to know who he's using for contracted work in the Pacific Northwest, and whether any of those names have histories that suggest they move beyond surveillance. Caro's expression said what it usually said when Damien stated something that Caro had already understood, but had been hoping would remain unstated. I'll make calls. And get the letters copied. She wants originals. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. She asked for the originals, Caro said. She asked for what she needs, Damien said, and walked out. At 2 o'clock, Mara was standing on the sidewalk outside the school when Noah came through the double doors with the dinosaur backpack and the half-unlaced right sneaker that she was always tying back up. He saw her and did the small recalibration that children do when they see a parent at pickup in place of the usual routine. The brief question of whether something is wrong, followed by the decision to accept the departure from normal as simply a different kind of normal. You're early, he said. Come on. She took his hand. He let her. He was 7, and he still let her hold his hand in public, and she was aware this would not last much longer, and she held on. They walked toward home along the harbor road, the wind off the water cold enough to matter. Noah started talking about something that had happened at lunch involving a disagreement over the rules of a game she'd never heard of, and she let his voice fill the space around her and breathed and watched the street and thought. She thought about the letters. She thought about 11 months of trying and what it cost to stop trying. She thought about Marcus Webb, whom she'd never met, who had made a calculation 8 years ago about who she was and what she was worth, and had decided the answer was a problem, and had acted accordingly. She thought about Damien Ashcroft, sitting in that lobby chair with the specific quality of stillness that she had recognized from the first moment he sat at her counter before she'd known who he was, as the stillness of someone carrying a great deal of weight and carrying it without permission to put it down. She thought about Noah's eyes. Mom, Noah said. You're squeezing my hand. She loosened her grip. Sorry. He looked up at her, the steel blue eyes in the gray afternoon light. Is something going on? She looked down at him and thought about what to say, and what not to say, to a 7-year-old whose world had been exactly the dimensions she'd built for him, and was about to become significantly larger. There's a lot going on, she said. I'm going to explain some of it to you tonight. Not all of it. Not yet. But some. He digested this. Is it bad? Some of it's complicated, she said, and some of it's something I've been waiting a long time to understand. He thought about this for a block. Then, okay. They walked on. The harbor glittered flatly to their left. The town moved around them in its ordinary way. The fisherman, the hardware store, the smell of salt and diesel, and the damp cedar of old buildings. Behind them, 3 blocks back, a man in a gray coat stepped out of a doorway and watched them walk, and raised his phone to his ear and said something into it and waited for the answer. The answer, when it came, made him put the phone away and reach instead for the second device in his jacket. Not a phone, but something smaller and darker and shaped for a very different kind of conversation. He followed them for another block, and then he didn't need to follow anymore because he already knew exactly where they were going. The man in the gray coat did not follow them all the way home. He didn't need to. Damien understood this when Caro called him at 2:47 that afternoon with the flat, careful voice he used when the news had moved past inconvenient into genuinely dangerous. "We have a problem," Caro said. Damien was standing at the hotel window. He'd been standing there since Mara left, which was not something he would have admitted to anyone. "Tell me." "My contact in Webb's contracted network just went dark. He was supposed to check in at 2. He hasn't. His phone is off." A pause. "He's been reliable for 4 years." Damien calculated. A surveillance asset going dark meant one of 3 things. He'd been burned, he'd been bought, or he was no longer in a position to make phone calls. Given the timing, given what Webb's people would have seen outside the diner that morning, the third option was the one that mattered. "Webb knows I made contact with her," Damien said. "He will within the hour if he doesn't already." "How many assets does he have in the area?" "At minimum, 2 vehicles confirmed. There may be more. My contact's last report mentioned a 3rd individual he hadn't been able to place." Caro's voice stayed level with the effort of a man who had been through enough of these situations to know that leveling was the only useful contribution he could make. "Damien, if Webb's moved out of the surveillance phase..." "He has." Damien turned from the window. "Get the car. I need to be at her apartment. If you go there now and his people are watching, they're already watching. The question is whether they're watching or whether they're moving." He was already crossing the room toward the operational bag. "Those are 2 different things, and the window between them is closing." He heard Caro stand on the other end of the line. 10 minutes, Caro said, and hung up. Damien opened the bag. He moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Not often, not casually, but enough times that the sequence had become physical memory rather than thought. He was not a man who enjoyed violence. He had never confused that fact with the separate fact that he was very capable of it. He was downstairs in 8 minutes. Mara was making dinner when the knock came. Not the apartment door, the downstairs door, the one that opened onto the street, the one she kept double-locked out of habit. She had Noah at the kitchen table with his homework spread across it. The math worksheet she'd seen the horse drawings on that morning, now apparently lost entirely under a drift of colored pencils and a library book about deep-sea fish. She heard the knock and felt the specific frequency of it. 3, deliberate, neither tentative nor aggressive, and stood still for a moment with the wooden spoon in her hand. "Stay there," she said to Noah. He looked up from the fish book. He was reading about anglerfish. He looked back down. She went to the window that faced the street and looked out carefully, staying to the side of the glass. Damien Ashcroft was on the sidewalk below. He was looking up at the building and not at the street, which told her he had already looked at the street and dealt with what he'd found there, or decided it wasn't the immediate problem. He had the particular stillness of someone operating on a clock that only he could see. She went downstairs. She opened the door and looked at him and said, "I told you not to come here." "I know." He didn't move from the step. "A man followed you home. Gray coat, approximately 6 feet. He stopped at the corner of Calder and Harbor and made a call. He's not there now, which is the part that worries me." She absorbed this. "How long ago?" 90 minutes. I've had someone on this street since then." He held her eyes. "The man he called. I believe I know who that is. He does contract work for Webb. He doesn't do surveillance." "What does he do?" Damien said nothing, and that said everything. Mara looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in. She locked the door behind him, both locks, the chain, and led him up the stairs, her hand on the banister, keeping her footsteps quiet out of the reflex of living above a hardware store with an owner who worked early mornings. Damien followed without asking questions about the building or the neighbors or anything else. He was mapping exits. She could tell by the way his head moved, slight, almost imperceptible, but she was watching for it. Noah looked up when they came into the kitchen. The moment was nothing and everything simultaneously. Damien stopped just inside the kitchen doorway, and Noah looked at him from across the table with the angler fish book open in front of him, and neither of them spoke, and Mara stood between them and watched the recognition move through Damien's face. Not of features, because he'd seen photographs, but of something less definable, the particular quality of a person in person rather than in documentation. Noah looked at Damien the way he looked at most things he hadn't categorized yet, with the steady, unhurried attention that made adults uncomfortable because it didn't ask for their reassurance or perform the expected social niceties. "Who are you?" Noah said. Damien looked at Mara. "This is someone I knew a long time ago," Mara said. "He's here because there's a situation we need to handle. You're going to stay in your room for a little while, okay? Take the fish book." Noah looked at Damien for another moment. Then he picked up the fish book, pushed back from the table, and walked toward the hallway door. He paused at the doorway. "Are we in trouble?" he said, and he was addressing his mother, but he was looking at Damien. "We're handling it," Mara said. Noah went. His door closed, not slammed, the particular careful close of a child who has decided to listen from behind it. Mara recognized the sound. She'd made the same one herself at his age. She turned to Damien. "Sit down." "We don't have—" "Sit down." She pointed at the table. "If there's a man somewhere on this block who does more than surveillance work, you need to tell me everything before we do anything else, because I'm not moving my son out of this apartment based on, I believe I know. I need to know. All of it. Right now." He sat down. She stood across the table from him and crossed her arms and waited, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something between frustration and something rawer than that. And then he started talking. What? He talked for 20 minutes. He told her about Webb, not the outline he'd given at the hotel, but the structure of it, the real architecture. Webb had joined the organization when Damien's predecessor, a man named Colvin, was still running it. Webb had been Colvin's logistics manager, efficient and invisible in the way certain men made themselves invisible on purpose. When Damien took control at 24, through a process that had been neither clean nor simple, Webb had offered his continued service with a smoothness that Damien now understood had not been loyalty, but positioning. A new principle, an organization in transition, and Webb already embedded so deeply in the infrastructure that removing him would have meant dismantling things that couldn't afford to be dismantled yet. So Damien had kept him, and Webb had been good at his job, genuinely good. The kind of good that makes you stop asking questions, because the results keep coming and the machine keeps running and you direct your skepticism toward the people who are failing you rather than the ones who aren't. Mara listened. She listened the way she did everything, without performing the listening, without nodding or making sounds of comprehension, just taking it in and filing it and watching his face. "The financial structure," she said when he paused. "He controls it?" "He manages the movement of funds through the legitimate facades. He doesn't control the assets directly. Those are distributed deliberately, but he controls the paperwork, the provenance documentation, the records that make money look like it came from somewhere it didn't. So if those records were disrupted, the whole facing infrastructure comes apart." "Yes." He looked at her. "But Webb has copies of everything, has had for years. Leverage, in case he ever needed it. Against you. Against everyone." She uncrossed her arms, walked to the window, looked at the street, different window than the bedroom, this one faced the alley, and looked at the dark and the wet pavement and said, "He kept those letters because if you'd known about Noah, you'd have had something outside the organization, something he couldn't manage." She turned back. "A child changes what you're willing to burn down." Damien said, "Yes." "He didn't do it to protect the organization," she said. "He did it to protect his position in it. You without attachments are a man who needs the structure around him. You with a child, with a family, are a man who might one day decide the structure isn't worth the cost." Damien was quiet. "That's what you've been thinking since you found the letters," she said. Not a question. Among other things, he said. She came back to the table. She sat down across from him. The kitchen was very quiet. The radiator knocked once, distantly, and stopped. From behind the hallway door, she could hear the faint rustle of Noah doing whatever he was doing in his room. "What do we do?" she said. "I need to call Webb. Tonight. I need to give him a version of this that makes him believe he still has time to manage it." He was looking at the table, which means I need to give him something true enough to be convincing and controlled enough not to accelerate his timeline. "You're going to lie to him. I'm going to tell him I found you, that you have no knowledge of anything connected to him or the organization, and that I'm handling the situation quietly." He looked up. He won't believe it entirely, but he'll want to. Men like Webb want their calculations confirmed. He calculated that you were ignorable for 8 years. He'll want to believe that's still true. Mara thought about this. What does it buy us? 24 hours, maybe 36. And in 36 hours, I move Webb into a position where he can't act without exposing himself, which requires finding the contractor who followed you today and identifying exactly what Webb has authorized. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one nobody used except her, and took down a shoebox. She put it on the table between them. "Caro's copies came this afternoon," she said. "I've been going through them." He looked at the shoebox. "And? The letters are letters. What's more useful is the administrative notation on the envelopes, the receipt markings. Your organization used a coded intake system for correspondence." She lifted the lid. Inside were papers, organized with the neat economy of someone used to making limited space work. The code on these letters traces to a specific administrative desk at a specific address in London. I cross-referenced it with the financial documents Caro included. She found a sheet of paper covered in her own handwriting. Columns, dates, notations. That administrative desk was managed by someone who reported directly to Webb. Not a junior administrator, a specific individual named in the payroll records from that period. Damien looked at the paper. "She's still employed by the organization," Mara said. "In a different capacity, moved to accounting about 6 years ago." Damien was very still. "Her name is on this sheet," Mara said. "And so is the financial notation for a lump payment made to a personal account 18 months after the letters were received. Not a payroll deposit. A separate transfer, irregular, run through one of the legitimate facades." She held his eyes. Someone paid her to keep quiet about what she'd done. That payment is traceable. Damien picked up the sheet of paper. He looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that Mara could trace the exact moment when what he was reading crossed from data into understanding. The slight shift in his jaw. The change in the quality of the stillness. "How long did this take you?" he said. "About 3 hours?" She sat back down. "I was an accounting student before I dropped out to come to America. I can read financial documents." He looked at her. "I didn't come to Edinburgh on a whim," she said. "I was on a research exchange program. I was going to be a forensic accountant." A pause, and something in her expression that was not quite bitterness, but contained it, the way a stone contains the pressure that formed it. "Different life." He set the paper down. He looked at the shoebox, at her careful columns of notations, at the 7 years of a different kind of arithmetic she'd been doing instead. Then his phone rang. He took it out and looked at the screen, and whatever was there changed his face entirely. Not dramatically, not with any of the obvious markers of alarm, but the way a shift in weather changes a landscape. Everything the same and nothing the same. He stood up from the table. "I need to take this." He stepped into the short hallway between the kitchen and the front door. Mara stayed at the table. She could hear his voice, low, controlled, monosyllabic, but not the words. She looked at her notations and listened to the tone of it and felt the cold thing spreading up from her stomach. He came back in 40 seconds. He didn't sit back down. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with an expression she was learning, the one that meant he had information he was calculating whether to give her and how much. "Tell me," she said. "Caro has identified the contractor," he said, "the man in the gray coat. And? His name is a name. What matters is his history." He's done 3 jobs for Webb over the past 4 years, contracted through a shell. He paused. None of those jobs involved surveillance. The cold thing reached her chest. What did they involve? The first 2 were property acquisitions that required the prior owners to become cooperative. He said it evenly. The third one, the previous individual who held a position Webb wanted, is currently listed as a missing person in Leeds. Mara sat with that for exactly 1 breath. He's here to kill us, she said. He's here to make a decision, Damien said. Whether to act depends on what Webb tells him, which is why I need to call Webb in the next 10 minutes, before his contractor makes contact. And if Webb has already decided, then the call either slows him down or it doesn't. He held her eyes. Either way, you and Noah cannot stay in this apartment tonight. She stood up. The shoebox was on the table. She looked at it and made a quick, practical assessment. What she could carry, what she needed to take, what could be left. The habit of the woman who'd been doing contingency arithmetic her whole adult life. There's a place, she said. A storage unit on Birch Road on the edge of town. It's rented under my landlord's name. He lets me keep a few things there. No connection to me on paper. She was already moving toward the hallway. I can have Noah ready in 5 minutes. Mara. She stopped. I'm sorry, he said. It came out flat and insufficient, which was exactly what it was, and he seemed to know it because he didn't follow it with anything. She looked at him for a moment. Make your call, she said. 5 minutes. She went to Noah's room. The call to Marcus Webb lasted 9 minutes. Damien made it from the kitchen while Mara moved through the apartment with the quiet, systematic speed of someone dismantling a life they'd built knowing it might need to be dismantled. He could hear her, drawers, the soft thud of a bag, Noah's low voice asking something, her low voice answering. Webb picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. Damien. The voice was the same as it had always been, measured, warm in a surface way, the voice of a man who'd spent years performing trustworthiness until it had become, at some level, genuine. That was the thing about Webb. He wasn't a pure construct. He'd actually believed, probably still believed, that what he'd done served some legitimate purpose. Marcus. Damien sat at the kitchen table and kept his voice at its most ordinary register. I've been meaning to call. You've been in Oregon. I have. A brief pause. The Hargrove meetings. Among other things, he let that sit. Let Webb decide how much he knew. Let Webb's own anxiety do work. There's a situation I wanted to discuss with you directly. What situation? A personal one. I found someone here, a woman I knew years ago. Someone with no connection to any of our current activities. He kept his voice measured, factual, the tone of a man reporting a minor administrative complication. She's been living here quietly for some time. I wanted you to know I'm handling it. The silence on the other end was 3 seconds, long enough to confirm everything. Webb was deciding how much to admit, whether to admit anything, whether the offer of normality was genuine or a trap. Handling it how? Webb said. The way I handle personal matters. Quietly. Damien looked at the shoebox on the table, at Mara's columns of notations, at 8 years of invisible architecture coming apart under 3 hours of applied intelligence. There's nothing to manage, Marcus. I just wanted you to hear it from me. Another pause. Shorter. Of course, Webb said. Is there anything you need? No, Damien said. Enjoy your evening. He hung up. He sat for a moment with the phone on the table. Webb had not withdrawn the contractor. That would have required admitting the contractor existed. He'd said, of course, and enjoy your evening and let the conversation end, which was the response of a man who hadn't changed his plans, but wanted to appear as though no plans existed. Damien stood up and went to the hallway and said, We need to go now. Mara came out of Noah's room with a bag on her shoulder and Noah beside her, dressed, backpack on, dinosaur backer and all, his face carrying the careful blankness of a child who has been told something serious is happening and has decided the correct response is to be as unhelpful to the problem as possible. She had a second bag in her hand. The shoebox was in it. He could see the outline. Car's out back, Damien said. Alley entrance. She nodded once, looked at Noah. "Stick close," she said. "I know," Noah said. They went downstairs in the dark, no lights, Damien's hand on the rear door, his body between them and the alley opening while he checked the space. The alley was wet and quiet, a single light at the far end. No movement. He led them out. They were 3 steps from the car when the door of the building behind them, the hardware store's rear entrance, opened. The man in the gray coat was not wearing gray anymore. He was in dark clothing, and he had the loose, functional stillness of someone whose body was already ahead of his conscious mind, already doing the calculus of angles and distances that the job required. He was not alone. A second figure stepped from the shadows at the alley's far end, cutting off the exit. 7 feet of distance. The car between them and the second man. Noah made a sound, small, involuntary, the sound a child makes when the thing they've been told not to be afraid of turns out to be real. Mara put her hand on the back of his neck, not gripping, just there. Damien stepped forward, putting himself between Noah and the man in the dark clothing, and said, with a very specific quality of calm, "This is going to go one of 2 ways." The man in the dark clothing looked at him with the flat professional assessment of someone who has heard every version of this speech. "Mr. Webb sends his regards," he said. "I know," Damien said. "The question is whether Webb knows that everything he buried in 2017 is in that bag." He didn't gesture toward Mara. He kept his eyes on the man in front of him. "And whether Webb knows that copies of it were sent to 3 separate locations 4 hours ago with instructions to go to a specific federal contact if the woman who sent them doesn't make a phone call in the next 12 hours. The man in the dark clothing didn't move, but something shifted in the economy of his posture. The small, nearly invisible adjustment of someone whose instructions had just encountered a variable they hadn't been briefed on. "You can call Webb," Damien said. "Or I can. But whoever makes that call, the math is now different." He held the man's eyes. "Webb contracted you for a clean solution. What I'm offering is the only clean solution that actually exists. Everyone walks away tonight, and Webb has 24 hours to make a decision before that documentation reaches people it cannot be recalled from." Silence. The second man at the end of the alley hadn't moved. Rain ticked against the dumpsters. The man in the dark clothing reached into his jacket. Damien moved. What happened in the next 11 seconds was not graceful, and it was not the clean, choreographed violence of films. It was fast and ugly, and contained the specific desperation of a man fighting, not for himself, but for the 2 people behind him, which changes the geometry of everything. Damien took the hit that was coming because blocking it would have required moving backward, and moving backward meant moving toward Noah, and that wasn't acceptable. He took it across the jaw and used the momentum to drive forward, and the man in the dark clothing was good, but he was working alone in the immediate distance while his partner was 60 feet away, and 60 feet was enough. The second man was running now, and Damien had 3 seconds, and he used them. He got the car door open. "Get in," he said. His voice was different now, stripped of everything except the mechanics of instruction. "Back seat, both of you. Down." Mara moved without hesitation. She had Noah in the back seat in 4 seconds, her body over his, the bag with the shoebox still on her shoulder. Damien was in the front. The car was moving before the second man reached the alley entrance. They came out onto Harbor Road doing 40, which was 20 over the posted limit, and Damien straightened the wheel and didn't slow down. Noah said, from the back seat in a very small voice, "That man hit you." "He did," Damien said. "Does it hurt?" Damien looked in the rear-view mirror. Mara had her arm around the boy, her face close to his hair. She was looking at Damien in the mirror with the expression he was coming to understand was her default under pressure. Not calm exactly, but the thing that stands in for calm when you've run out of the real article and still need to function. "A little," Damien said. Noah considered this. "Okay," he said. They drove north along the coast road in the dark, the rain on the windshield and the ocean somewhere to the left beyond the dark. And Damien drove and breathed and thought about the call Webb was receiving right now from a contractor who'd just been handed a variable he hadn't been briefed on, and the calculation that call would trigger, and the fact that 24 hours was almost certainly an optimistic estimate. In the back seat, Mara looked out the rain-blurred window at the dark coast sliding past, and she held her son. And she thought about the shoebox and the 11 letters and the forensic accounting she'd been building in her head for 3 hours and everything she hadn't told Damien yet. The part that was more than documentation. The part that was a thread she'd pulled while going through Caro's files. A thread that connected Webb's shell companies, not just to the letters, but to something older and larger. Something that didn't just implicate Webb, but called into question the foundation of everything Damien believed about who had built the organization he thought he'd inherited. She hadn't told him yet because she hadn't been sure. She was sure now, and the telling of it was going to break something that couldn't be put back together. She looked at the rearview mirror. Damien's eyes found hers for a moment. Steady, measuring, already calculating the next move. She looked away first. Outside, the dark coast ran on, and the rain came harder, and the road ahead narrowed to the width of what the headlights could reach, which was not very far at all. They drove for 40 minutes before Damien pulled off the coast road. The motel was the kind of place that existed specifically to be overlooked. Single story, 12 units, a vacancy sign with 2 letters burned out, sitting at the junction of the highway, and a logging road that went nowhere anyone needed to go. Cash only. The man behind the desk was watching a small television and did not look up when Damien slid bills across the counter, and did not look up when Damien took the key, and this was exactly what Damien had been looking for. Unit 9 was at the far end, away from the office, with a view of the logging road and the tree line. Damien checked it before he let them in. Bathroom, closet, under the beds, the window latch. Mara watched him do it without comment. Noah watched him do it with the focused attention he gave to most things, and then sat on the edge of the nearer bed and unzipped his backpack and took out the anglerfish book, because apparently a child who had just witnessed a violent altercation in an alley still needed something to do with his hands, and anglerfish were what he had. Mara set the bag with the shoebox on the small table by the window. She sat down in the single chair. She looked at Damien. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. Sat on the edge of the second bed, facing her. The lamp between them threw a yellow light that made everyone look slightly worse than they were, which in Damien's case meant the bruise forming along his left jaw was visible now, dark and swelling, a souvenir of the alley. "There's something else," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know. You've had something since we left the apartment. You've been deciding whether to say it." He held her eyes. "Say it." She glanced at Noah, who had opened the fish book and appeared to be reading, which meant he was listening. She looked back at Damien. "Not all of it now," she said. "The short version." She reached into the shoebox and pulled out a sheet of paper. Not her own notations, but one of Caro's documents, a financial record she'd marked with a pen. She set it on the bed between them. "This transfer, the payment made to Webb's administrative contact in 2017, the one I identified earlier. I told you it was traceable." "Yes, I traced it." She put her finger on a number in the middle of the page. "It didn't originate from Webb's accounts. It didn't originate from any of the facades I recognized from the organizational documents Caro gave me." She paused. "It originated from a holding company registered to Colvin." Damien went still. "Colvin is dead," he said. "The company isn't. It was dormant for 3 years after his death, and then it was reactivated, 6 months before your Edinburgh trip." She watched his face. "The reactivation was authorized by a signatory I couldn't identify from the documents I have. But the account it funded, Webb's payment to the administrator, was opened the same month you came back from Edinburgh." The room was quiet except for the rain on the roof and the distant sound of the television in the motel office. "You're telling me Webb didn't act alone," Damien said. "I'm telling you the money that paid for those letters to disappear came from a company that should have died with your predecessor, and didn't." She kept her voice even and low. "I don't know what that means yet. I need more documents than Caro gave me. But what it might mean is that whoever has been running that company has been running something alongside your organization for years. Something you don't know about, using infrastructure you thought you controlled." Damien picked up the document. He looked at it. She watched him. Watched the specific quality of stillness that fell over him. Not the stillness of shock, because she didn't think he shocked easily, but the stillness of a man recalculating everything from the foundation up, A man discovering that the building he'd built his life in might have rooms he'd never been shown. Colvin had a son, Damien said, very quiet. I know, Mara said. It's in the organizational history Caro included. Estranged. No involvement in the business. That's what the record says. She let that land. Noah turned a page of the fish book. Tomorrow, Damien said. He set the document down. We deal with Webb tomorrow. Tonight you and Noah sleep. I'll take the chair. You won't sleep in the chair. I won't sleep regardless. He looked at her steadily. You should. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Noah, who had reached the section on bioluminescence and was holding the book at the angle that maximized the lamplight. Lie down, she told Noah. You can read for 10 more minutes. He lay down without argument, which meant he was tired, which meant the evening had used even him up. She pulled the blanket over him. He kept the book. She turned the lamp on the bedside table to its lowest setting and came back to the table and sat across from Damien in the dim. Tell me about Colvin, she said. Low. Not a conversation Noah needed. Another time. Now. Because if there's someone connected to Colvin who's been watching your organization from the outside for 8 years, I need to understand what Colvin was before I can understand what they want. She held his eyes. I can read documents. I can't read history I don't have. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Colvin built the organization before I existed in it. He was the kind of man who operated through total information control. He knew everything about everyone around him, and he used what he knew. He died of a cardiac event, officially. I was 24. I had enough leverage to step into the space he left, and I did. A pause. I always believed the cardiac event was natural. He was 61, he smoked, he didn't take care of himself. And now? He didn't answer immediately. The rain came harder for a moment and then eased. Now I'm wondering what a dormant company and an estranged son tells me about how natural it was, he said. She said nothing. She picked up the document again and looked at the account number and thought about threads and where they led and what you found when you followed them all the way back. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep in the chair, which she hadn't planned to do. Damien's phone rang at 4:17 in the morning. It was Caro, and Caro's voice had the stripped quality it got when events had moved past the point of managed delivery into simple report. Webb made contact with the contractor 40 minutes ago. My source inside the contracted network, not the one who went dark, a separate one, relayed the call. Damien was at the window, watching the logging road in the pre-dawn dark. What did Webb authorize? Full resolution. A pause. He used the phrase tied off. All three. All three. Mara, Noah, Damien himself. He's moved past protecting himself, Damien said. He's decided the documentation risk is less than the identification risk. If you go to any authority with what you have, you're also exposing yourself. He's calculating that you won't. Caro's voice was careful. He may be right, ordinarily, but he doesn't know what she found in those financial records. No. Damien turned from the window. Mara was asleep in the chair, her head at an angle that would hurt when she woke up. Noah was ashape under the blanket, breathing. How many assets does he have mobile? At minimum 3. The contractor from the alley and 2 others who came in on a morning flight from Seattle. They've been tracked to a motel 8 miles south of your current position. 8 miles. Pre-dawn. 2 hours until light. Caro. He kept his voice below the level of the room. The lighthouse at Pelican Head, is it still decommissioned? Since 2019, yes. Why? Because it's the only elevated position within 20 miles with sightlines on every access road and a single entry point I can control. He moved to the small table, picked up the shoebox, checked the documents inside. I need you to get a message to Webb, not from me. I want him to think it came from the contractor. What message? That I've been located. That I'm moving toward Pelican Head alone to make a drop. That I told the contractor the documents are cached there, and I'll trade them for the woman and the boy being left alone. He paused. Make it feel like I've panicked, like I've separated from them and I'm trying to negotiate. Caro was quiet for 3 seconds. You want him to come to the lighthouse. I want him to send the contractors to the lighthouse, and I want Webb himself to come, because a man like Webb doesn't trust a resolution this size to contracted labor. He'll want to be there. Damien looked at the shoebox. And when he's there, away from London, away from his infrastructure, I want him standing in front of everything Mara found. That's not a plan, Caro said. That's a direction. I'll build the rest when I see the ground. He looked at Mara in the chair, the angle of her neck, the shoebox under his hand. 3 hours, Caro. Get the message to Webb. He hung up. Then he went to the chair and crouched in front of it and said quietly, Mara. Her eyes opened immediately, which told him she hadn't been fully asleep for a while. We need to move, he said. She straightened in the chair and pressed her hand against the back of her neck where it had stiffened. She looked at Noah, still asleep. She looked at Damien. Tell me, she said. He told her. She said no 3 times before she said yes. The no's were not unreasonable. The first was about Noah. She would not bring Noah within 20 miles of a decommissioned lighthouse at which armed men were going to arrive. Damien said there was a woman, a local contact Caro had used for logistics in the area, who could take the boy to a specific address and stay with him. Mara asked him how well he trusted this contact. He said well enough, which was not the answer she wanted, but she looked at him and decided it was the honest one, and the honest one was what she had. The second no was about her role. She was not going to stand in a lighthouse and be a person who was protected. He told her he wasn't asking her to be protected. He was asking her to be the person in the room who understood the financial documentation well enough to explain what it meant, and to whom, because the person he needed to explain it to was Webb, and he needed Webb to understand it completely and irreversibly before anything else happened. She looked at the shoebox and thought about 11 letters, and a dormant company, and an estranged son, and said nothing for a while. The third no was about trust. She said she didn't know him. That 3 weeks in Edinburgh 8 years ago and 3 days on the Oregon coast was not a foundation. That she was about to put her life and her son's life into the hands of a man who ran a criminal organization and had kept her under surveillance for a week, and whose enemy was currently sitting 8 miles away. He said, I know. She waited. I don't have a credential to offer you, he said. I don't have a history you can verify or a character reference from anyone you'd trust. I have 11 letters I never answered and a son I didn't know existed and 8 years of a mistake I can't fix. He looked at her. What I have is this. Webb wants all 3 of us gone. The only way to change that is to put him in a position where acting against us costs him more than standing down. That requires the documentation. That requires you. He paused. And I would rather burn every piece of it to the ground than put you in a room where you aren't prepared for every possible outcome. She looked at him for a long time in the dim motel lamplight. Show me the lighthouse, she said. They arrived at Pelican Head 40 minutes before dawn. Caro had gotten a vehicle to them at 5 a.m. Different plates. Nothing traceable. And Damien drove the coast road north with the headlights on low and the ocean invisible to the left. Just the sound of it through the glass, permanent and indifferent. Noah was in the back with the woman Caro had sent, a compact, practical woman named Dean, who smelled like coffee and spoke to Noah about deep-sea fish with what appeared to be genuine expertise. Noah had asked her 3 questions about anglerfish before they'd cleared the motel parking lot, and she'd answered all 3 correctly, and Mara had decided that was the closest thing to a credential available. Mara and Damien were dropped at the base of the Pelican Head access road, and the car continued north with Noah and Dean, and Mara stood on the road and watched the taillights disappear and breathed. He'll be fine, Damien said. I know, she said. She turned toward the lighthouse path. Show me the building. The lighthouse had been decommissioned for 4 years, and it showed the keeper's cottage at the base was boarded, the path up the headland was overgrown, the railing along the cliff edge was salt-rusted and in places missing entirely. The lighthouse tower itself was intact, a white cylinder against the pre-dawn gray, the light long dead. The door at the base was padlocked, and Damien dealt with the padlock in a way that Mara noted without commenting on. Inside, the tower was cold and smelled of brine and rust, and the particular emptiness of a space that had been useful and wasn't anymore. A spiral staircase, iron, climbed to the lamp room. The windows at the lamp room level looked out on every approach. The access road, the headland path, the parking area at the cliff's edge, and beyond all of it, 300 feet down the cliff face, the Pacific, gray and vast and making its permanent noise. Damien showed her the sight lines, showed her the single entry door, showed her the single entry door, showed her the position in the lamp room from which a person could see anyone approaching a full 3 minutes before they arrived. Webb will bring at least one other person, he said. He won't come alone. The contractors. Possibly. Or his own associate, someone from London who traveled separately. He was looking out the lamp room window at the access road, which was empty and gray in the pre-dawn. When he arrives, I'll be visible, on the access road, where he expects me. You stay in the lamp room until I bring him inside. And then you show him what you found. She looked at him. You think documentation stops a man who just authorized 3 assassinations? I think documentation that connects him to Colvin's son stops him, Damien said. Because whatever arrangement Webb has with Colvin's son, and there is one, we both know there is, it depends on Webb maintaining a position inside an organization that has no idea that arrangement exists. The moment that arrangement is documented and in the hands of someone outside it, Webb's leverage flips. He's not holding the cards anymore. The cards are holding him. Mara looked out the lamp room window at the ocean below. The sky was beginning its gray transition toward something that was almost light. She could see the access road, the empty parking area, the scrub grass of the headland. If it doesn't work, she said, it will work. If it doesn't, he was quiet for a moment. Then we deal with what comes next. Together. He said it without decoration, without the performance of reassurance. Just the words, flat and real. She looked at him. She looked at the bruise on his jaw, darker now in the morning gray. She looked at the way he stood at the window, shoulders back, breathing controlled, the whole body organized around a single purpose. She thought about Edinburgh, about a man at a gallery opening who had stopped for no reason she'd understood at the time, and looked at a photograph of an Oregon coast and started a conversation with a woman in a thin jacket. She thought about 11 letters and the life she'd built in the gap they'd left. She thought about Noah and his steel blue eyes and the way he'd asked, "Are we in trouble?" with the directness of someone who already understood that the answer was yes and wanted to know how bad. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay," she said again. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do." Webb arrived at 7:43. Damien saw the vehicle from the lamp room. He'd sent Mara up when the car appeared at the far end of the access road, a dark sedan moving slowly in the early light, and now he stood at the base of the lighthouse tower with his jacket open and his hands visible and the shoebox under his arm, and waited. The sedan stopped in the parking area. 3 doors opened. Webb was the second figure out. Damien recognized him across 60 meters. The particular set of the man, the way he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had spent years making themselves appear unhurried. He was 52, fit in the maintained way of a man who understood his body as a professional asset, gray at the temples, wearing a coat that cost more than most people's rent. He looked at Damien across the parking area with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was now discovering the rehearsal hadn't quite covered the reality. The 2 men flanking him were not the contractor from the alley. They were the Seattle arrivals, bigger, younger, and positioned with the practiced spacing of men who understood how to divide sightlines. 3 of them. Damien had Caro somewhere on the headland path. He knew that. He'd arranged it without telling Mara because there were certain preparations she didn't need to participate in. But Caro was one man, and Caro's function was documentation and communication, not force. So essentially Damien had himself. He'd worked with worse. Webb walked across the parking area. He stopped 12 feet from Damien and looked at him, and there was a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, in which they simply looked at each other, and Damien let himself feel the specific weight of what looking at Marcus Webb now meant. 6 years. 6 years of proximity, of reliance, of the specific intimacy of shared enterprise and mutual risk. And underneath all of it, like a thing buried in a foundation, the 8 years before that. The letters, the boy, the life Mara had built alone while this man stood 2 feet from Damien every day and said nothing. "You look tired," Webb said. "I've had a difficult night," Damien said. "I heard." Webb's eyes went to the shoebox. "You said you had documents to trade." "I have documents. I didn't say I was trading them." Webb's expression stayed even. It was a disciplined face. Damien had always known that, had always recognized in Webb the specific discipline of a man who had decided long ago that his face was a surface to be managed. "Then why are we here?" "Come inside," Damien said. "I don't think—" Marcus. Not aggressive, not loud. The tone he used when he needed someone to understand that the conversation had only one direction. "Come inside." Webb looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once to the 2 men flanking him. "Stay," and followed Damien through the lighthouse door. The lamp room was a 20-foot climb up the iron staircase. Damien led, Webb followed. Neither of them spoke on the stairs, the sound of their feet on iron the only thing in the tower besides the permanent presence of the ocean through the walls. Mara was standing at the lamp room window when they came through the hatch. She was holding 3 sheets of paper against her chest. The specific 3 she'd selected the night before. The ones that traced the fullest and most direct line from the administrative payment to the dormant company to the reactivation authorization. She turned when they came in. Webb stopped on the top step. He looked at her. He looked at Damien. His expression did something it very rarely did. It moved without permission, the control slipping for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Mara Ellison," Damien said. "She's been doing forensic accounting since 5 o'clock this morning. Tell him what you found." She looked at Webb. She looked at him the way she looked at most difficult things, directly, without performance, with the flat and complete attention of someone who had decided that the only way through was through. She held up the first sheet. "This is a transfer record," she said. "The payment made to Linda Harrow in June of 2017. The woman who received your letters," she added to Damien without looking at him. "The payment that compensated her for the interception." She kept her eyes on Webb. "It didn't come from your accounts, Mr. Webb. It came from a holding company called Argent Sable Limited, registered in the Channel Islands, dormant from 2014 to 2016, reactivated by a signatory I couldn't identify." She paused. "Until this morning, when Damien told me about Colvin's son." Webb said nothing. His face was back under control. But his hands, Damien watched his hands, had gone very still in the specific way that hands go still when the body has decided that any movement might be the wrong one. She held up the second sheet. "This is the reactivation authorization for Argent Sable. The signatory's name is redacted in the copy I have, but the authorization code matches a format I found in 3 other documents Caro included. Documents that reference decisions made during Colvin's tenure. The authorization code format was discontinued when Damien took control." She let that land. "Whoever signed this reactivation in 2016 was using a code from a dead man's playbook, which means they had access to Colvin's administrative systems." "You should be careful," Webb said. His voice was very quiet. "About what you think you understand." "I think I understand this," she said. She held up the third sheet. "This is a payment from Argent Sable made 4 months ago, not to an administrator, to a logistics company in Portland, Oregon. The logistics company has 1 registered client." She looked at him. "The Hargrove family." The lamp room went completely silent. The Hargrove negotiation. The reason Damien had flown to Portland. The $40 million distribution arrangement that had brought him to the Oregon coast in the first place. Webb's eyes moved to Damien. "Damien, you set up the Hargrove meeting," Damien said. "It came out flat. The flatness of something that had been held at pressure for a long time and was now simply stated. You brought it to me 6 months ago. An opportunity. The Western Seaboard Network. You told me it came through a European contact. It did come through. It came through Colvin's son." Damien stepped forward. 1 step. Enough to change the geometry of the room. "Whatever you've been building with him since Colvin died, whatever arrangement you have, You brought me to Oregon to close a deal that was never about distribution. You brought me here because whatever Colvin's son wants, he wants it finalized in person, and you needed me in the same room, in the same city, and you needed her. He didn't gesture, but the air shifted toward Mara, to be a loose end that was already here. Webb looked at him, the controlled face, the gray temples, the coat that cost more than most people's rent. You were going to tie off everything in one place, Damien said. The woman, the boy, the documentation, and me. His voice was very calm. And then, whoever you've been running a second organization for, underneath mine, for the last 8 years, would have a clear field. Webb said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, you were never supposed to go to Edinburgh. It was not what Damien had expected him to say. That trip wasn't on the schedule, Webb continued. It was impulsive. You went because you were 23 and you were already too controlled. You needed to be loose somewhere for 3 weeks, and you picked Edinburgh because of some gallery connection that had nothing to do with work. Something moved in Webb's expression that was not quite the shape of an emotion Damien could name. Not guilt, not regret, but something adjacent to both that had been through enough years to calcify into something harder. When you came back, you were different, not obviously, but I could see it. I could see what it had cost you to leave. He paused. And then the letters started coming. So you buried them, Damien said. I protected the organization. You protected your position. Those were the same thing. Webb's voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 8 years maintaining an argument with himself. What you could have built, what we built, required everything. A child, a woman in America, the liability of attachment. It would have compromised every decision you made, every negotiation, every line you needed to hold. My son is 7 years old, Damien said. The words landed in the room and stayed there. My son, Damien said again. And you knew. You've known since the letters. You knew there was a child, and you watched me build an empire, and you stood 2 feet from me every day for 6 years, and you knew. Webb opened his mouth. And then, from outside, from below, from the parking area, came the sound of a car, moving fast, gravel, braking hard, and then 2 things happened almost simultaneously. Caro's voice on Damien's phone texted 4 words. Second vehicle incoming armed, and the door at the base of the lighthouse tower, 60 feet below, slamming open with a sound like a gun going off. The contractors. Not the ones Webb had brought, different ones, the advance team, the ones who hadn't stood in the parking area and waited, the ones who'd been positioned elsewhere on the headland and had been moving since before Webb walked through the door. Webb looked at the lamproom hatch. His face was doing something now that Damien had never seen it do. Call them off, Damien said. I can't, Webb said. I never could. The sound of boots on iron stairs came up through the floor of the lamproom. Fast, not trying to be quiet, the sound of men who had been told the calculation phase was over. Mara looked at Damien. The 3 sheets of paper were still in her hands. The window, he said. She turned. Below them, on the headland path, the sea. 300 feet of cliff and then the Pacific. And on the path itself, coming up from the south, Caro, 1 man, moving fast, and behind him, 2 more shapes that were not Caro's people, that were converging from the far side of the headland. Trapped. Above and below and on 3 sides, the ocean. The boots on the stairs were 1 level down, maybe 15 seconds. Damien turned to Webb and said the thing he'd been building toward since 4 in the morning, since the motel room, since the moment he'd understood what Caro's call meant. You said you can't call them off. That means whoever is giving the order isn't here. He stepped close enough that Webb had nowhere to look except at him. Colvin's son. Where is he? Webb looked at him, the controlled face, the 8 years of it. Where? Damien said. 10 seconds. The boots were close enough to hear individual footfalls now. Webb said 1 word. It was a name. Not a place, not an address. Just a name. But it was a name that changed everything. A name that Damien knew. A name that was so close to the center of the life he'd built that hearing it was like watching the ground open up beneath his own feet. and the name was still reverberating in the cold air of the lamp room when the hatch burst open and the first man came through it, and the last calculation began. The name Webb had said was Hargrove. Not the family, not the network. One specific person, Thomas Hargrove, the eldest son, the one who had managed the Western Seaboard operation while his father aged out of it, the one who had sat across from Damien twice in 4 days and discussed distribution margins and port logistics, and shaken hands at the end of the second meeting like a man closing a business arrangement, the one whose name was on the Hargrove letterhead, the one who had refilled Damien's coffee himself and said, with the easy warmth of a man performing trustworthiness, that he hoped this was the beginning of a long working relationship. Colvin's son. Not estranged, never estranged. Positioned. Hidden inside a different name, a different family's infrastructure, a different coast, waiting with the patience of someone who had been told since childhood that patience was the only currency that didn't depreciate. Damien had 3 seconds to process this before the first man came through the lamp room hatch. He was big, and he was fast, and he came through the hatch already moving, and Damien stepped into him rather than back because stepping back was the ocean, and stepping back was Mara. The collision was brutal and immediate. No technique, no economy, just the physics of 2 bodies deciding the same space, and Damien was smaller, but he was already committed, and commitment at close range is its own kind of force. They hit the lamp room wall and something cracked. The wall, a rib, Damien couldn't separate them in the moment, and then the second man was through the hatch. Mara moved. She didn't run. She moved toward the base of the lamp housing. The massive dead lens at the center of the room, waist-high, iron-framed, and she put it between herself and the second man, and she held the 3 sheets of paper against her chest like they were something that could stop a bullet, which they couldn't. But what she needed was a second, and the lamp housing gave her one. The second man had to go around it. 3 steps. She used all 3 of them. The window. The lamp room had 4 windows, one facing each compass point, and the south window looked over the headland path where Caro had been moving. She got to it and looked out and saw the headland path, and saw Caro down on one knee doing something she couldn't parse from the distance. And beyond him, the 2 men who'd been converging from the south had stopped, not fallen. And she understood they'd stopped because something had changed in their calculation, something on a phone, something that told them the parameters had shifted. She turned back to the room. Damien had put the first man down. Not cleanly. He was bleeding from somewhere above his ear, a line of dark red that reached his jaw, and he was moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing pain at the edge of their functional threshold. The second man had gotten around the lamp housing and was between Damien and the hatch, which meant between Damien and exit, which meant the geometry of the room had become a problem. Webb was against the far wall. He hadn't moved. He was watching with the expression of a man who had understood, somewhere in the last 90 seconds, that the situation had left the territory of plans and entered the territory of consequences, and the transition had cost him something he hadn't budgeted for. "Webb," Mara said. He looked at her. She held up the 3 sheets. "You said you can't call them off, but Hargrove can." She kept her voice even, kept her eyes on Webb's face. "Call him, right now. Tell him we have the documentation and it's already been transmitted, and the only way any of this stops is if he calls every asset off this headland in the next 2 minutes. Hargrove doesn't negotiate. He will when he understands what's been transmitted." She took 1 step toward Webb. The second contractor was watching her now instead of Damien, which was a mistake. And Damien used the mistake the way he used every available margin. Completely, without hesitation, with the focus of a man who had spent the last 4 days running on too little sleep and too much accumulated weight, and had arrived at the particular clarity that lives on the other side of both. He moved on the second contractor, and the room was briefly very loud, and then it wasn't. Webb had his phone out. Mara looked at him. He looked at her. He was 52 years old, and he had spent 8 years maintaining an architecture of control, and in the last 4 minutes, it had come apart the way things come apart when they've been built on a foundation that was never as solid as it looked. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but in the specific incremental way of a man watching his own calculations fail. He made the call. She listened to his voice, listened to the words, clipped, careful. The voice of a man delivering information he hadn't expected to deliver. She watched his face while he talked, and she thought about the letters, the 11 letters, and what it cost a 22-year-old woman to write each one and not be answered, and she let herself feel it. Not all of it, not the depth of it, but enough. She let herself feel enough to understand exactly what this moment was worth. Webb ended the call. He lowered the phone. "Done," he said. "I know," she said. "Caro has been recording this room for the last 40 minutes. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that was the last of the control going, not with drama, but with the quiet deflation of a long-held breath finally released. "You're thorough," he said. "I was going to be a forensic accountant," she said. The two contractors on the headland path left before the light fully arrived. Caro watched them go from his position and confirmed their departure in a text that Damien read while sitting on the lamproom floor with his back against the dead lens housing and a strip of his own shirt pressed against the cut above his ear. Mara had made the tourniquet without being asked, without fuss, with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. She had looked at the cut and determined it needed pressure, but not a hospital, and she had communicated this assessment and then provided it, and Damien had sat still and let her. Webb sat on the floor across the lamproom with his wrists secured by two of Caro's zip ties, which Caro had produced from his jacket with the air of a man who had been expecting this requirement. The two contractors who'd come through the hatch were alive and zip-tied and breathing. One was concussed, Damien thought, watching his eyes. And Caro was on the phone with a contact that Mara didn't ask about and Damien didn't explain. She stood at the south window and watched the headland path below and the ocean beyond it, which was steel and vast in the early morning light, and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened in this room, the way the ocean always was. She breathed. She let herself breathe without managing it, just air in and air out, until her pulse came down to something she recognized as her own. Thomas Hargrove. She'd never met him. She'd heard his name once, in passing, when Caro had mentioned the meetings Damien had been pushing. She thought about a man who had spent years embedded in a legitimate family business on the western seaboard, building toward a specific moment, waiting for an organization to be close enough to his father's old infrastructure that it could be reclaimed or consumed. She thought about what kind of patience that required, what kind of damage a childhood like that produced, raised in the knowledge of what your father built, told it had been taken, taught to wait. She understood patience. She'd spent 7 years practicing it without knowing that's what she was doing. "The recording," Damien said from the floor. She turned. "You said Caro has been recording." His voice was careful, not accusatory, just precise. "How long have you been planning to use it?" "Since the motel," she said. "Since you told me about the lighthouse plan. I called Caro while you were getting the car." He looked at her. The cut above his ear was dark against his skin. The bruise from the alley had matured overnight into something significant. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been through something and knew it, and wasn't trying to look like anything else. "You didn't tell me," he said. "You would have adjusted the plan around my safety," she said. "I didn't need you to." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, you didn't." She turned back to the window. Below on the path, Caro was finishing his call. He looked up at the lighthouse tower and their eyes met across the distance, and he nodded once, and she understood from the nod that the contact had been reached, that whatever came next was in motion. "Hargrove," she said. "Caro's contact is federal," Damien said, "not local. Someone I've maintained a careful relationship with for 4 years, the kind of relationship where neither party formally acknowledges the other, but information moves in ways that serve mutual interests." He paused. "The recording, the financial documentation, the Argent-Sable connection. It's enough. Hargrove's operation has been of interest to federal authorities for 2 years. What we've provided is the architecture they were missing. And Webb. Webb goes with the documentation." He said it without inflection. No satisfaction, no grief, just the fact of it. She thought about Webb sitting against the far wall with his wrists bound, 60 feet from the ocean, looking at the floor with the expression of a man who had run his last calculation and found it had come up short. She thought about what it cost to dismantle 8 years of a person's careful work in a single morning. She thought about how it felt to be on the receiving end of 8 years of someone else's calculation. She found she didn't have room for anything about Webb except the flat acknowledgement that it was done. Dean brought Noah to the address Caro had specified, a small house inland belonging to a woman who was apparently a retired logistics manager and who had, over 20 years of working adjacent to Caro's world, developed the specific skill of providing safe harbor without asking questions. She had toys. She had a dog, a large and gentle yellow one that Noah had apparently spent 2 hours telling things to in the way that children tell things to animals that they don't yet have the language to tell people. Mara arrived at 11 in the morning. She came around the side of the house and found Noah in the backyard with the dog, throwing a stick that the dog retrieved with the thoroughness of an animal that had decided this was the only important work in the world. She stopped at the yard gate and watched him. He hadn't seen her yet. He was wholly present in the yard, in the cold autumn light, in the specific and complete absorption of a child with an animal and a stick and nothing else required of him. She watched him until he turned, and then his face did the thing it did. The recalibration, the quick assessment, and then the particular quality of relief that children can't perform, that comes before they decide whether to show it. He ran across the yard. He ran into her, and she caught him and held on with the specific force of someone who had spent a night not being able to do this and needed to do it now. He let her hold on. He was 7, and he understood on some level, without the words for it, that right now holding on was what the situation required. "You okay?" she said, her face in his hair. "The dog's name is Biscuit," he said. "Okay." "He's really good at fetching." "I can see that." He pulled back enough to look at her. His eyes moved over her face the way they always did, that careful inventory. "There's a man in the front of the house," he said. She stilled. "He's been there for an hour," Noah said. "He doesn't come in. He just sits in the car." She looked toward the house, looked back at Noah. "Is it a black car?" "Blue," she breathed. "That's someone who works for someone I know. He's making sure you're okay." Noah absorbed this. "The man from the diner, with the eyes?" She looked at her son's face, at the steel blue eyes that had started all of it, that had caused a stranger to stop in a parking lot and look too long and call an investigator and fly across a country and stand between 2 armed men in an alley in the dark. At the face that was partly hers and partly someone else's and entirely its own thing, entirely Noah. "Yes," she said. "He sent the man in the blue car." Noah looked at her for a moment. "Is he coming here?" "I don't know yet." "Okay," Noah said, and turned back toward Biscuit, who had returned the stick and was waiting with the patient optimism of an animal that understands how these things work. "What?" Damien came in the afternoon. Caro drove him. He came to the front door and knocked, and the retired logistics manager answered and stepped back without a word, and he came through the house and out the back door and stood at the edge of the yard and looked at Mara, who was sitting on the back steps with a cup of coffee she'd been given and hadn't finished. Noah was on the far side of the yard with Biscuit and didn't look up immediately. Damien sat on the steps beside her. He'd cleaned up, the cut taped, the jacket different, the worst of the night's evidence managed. But he was tired in the way that doesn't clean up, the bone-deep kind that lives in how a person holds their head and how their shoulders sit. "Hargrove," she said, "federal custody as of 2 hours ago. His lawyers will complicate it, but the documentation is solid. The Argent Sable records, the payment chains, the 8 years of a parallel operation run through Colvin's original infrastructure." He looked at the yard, at Noah, at the dog. Webb confirmed most of it on the record before the federal contact arrived. He was more forthcoming than I expected. "He'd been holding it a long time," she said. "People like that, when it finally comes apart, sometimes they can't stop." Damien was quiet for a moment. "Colvin didn't die of a cardiac event," he said. She'd known. She'd seen enough in the documents to see the shape of it without being able to confirm it. She said nothing. Hargrove's mother, Colvin's partner from before the son was born, she managed it. Webb knew. He'd been present in the organization long enough to understand what had happened, and he'd used that knowledge as leverage over Hargrove for years. That's how the arrangement worked. Not loyalty. Mutual containment. He picked up a piece of gravel from the step edge and turned it in his fingers. Webb protected himself by making himself necessary to Hargrove. Hargrove tolerated Webb because Webb had enough on him to cause damage. 8 years of two men holding guns at each other and calling it a partnership. She looked out at the yard. "What happens to your organization?" "I dismantle it," he said. She turned to look at him. Not violently, not overnight. He was still looking at the yard. The legitimate facades are genuinely operational. They employ real people, generate real revenue. Those can become real things. The rest, the infrastructure that isn't legitimate, I've already begun the process of pulling it apart. The federal relationship I have gives me a window to do it in a way that doesn't end with me in a cell. He paused. It was always going to end. I told myself it wasn't, for years, because ending it was another way of saying everything I'd built was only what it was, and not what I'd convinced myself it could become. A pause. Your son's face in a photograph at a school crossing in Oregon ended 9 years of that particular self-deception in about 48 hours. She looked at the gravel in his hand. "That's not fair to put on him," she said. "On Noah." "I'm not putting it on him. I'm acknowledging what was already true." He set the piece of gravel down. "I was always going to end it. I just needed something I couldn't negotiate with." She was quiet for a moment. Biscuit had dropped the stick and was lying in the grass with his head on Noah's knee, and Noah was looking at something in the distance with the absorbed expression that meant he was thinking rather than observing. "What do you want?" she said. Not unkindly, directly, the way she asked everything. He looked at her. For a moment he didn't answer, and she let the silence sit, and he sat in it with the same quality she'd noticed from the beginning, the willingness to stay in a difficult space without trying to fill it. "I want to know him," Damien said. "I don't have the right to ask for more than that yet. Maybe not for a long time, but I want to know him." She looked out at Noah. Noah had seen Damien by now. She'd seen the moment of recognition, the careful noting of his presence, the deliberate choice to keep playing with the dog rather than come over immediately, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. "He already knows something happened," she said. "He's been with Dean for 6 hours, and he hasn't asked a single question about when you're coming, which means he's been saving them." She looked at her coffee cup. "He saves things up. He doesn't ask until he thinks it's worth asking. He gets that from someone." Damien said nothing. "I'm going to tell him," she said. "Not today, but soon. In the right way, in pieces, in a way he can carry." She turned to look at Damien. "And then what happens is up to him as much as either of us. He's 7, and I know that sounds... but he's not an ordinary 7. You've spent 4 days watching him. You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," Damien said. They sat on the back steps in the gray afternoon light, the ocean somewhere to the west behind the tree line, the dog and the boy in the yard, the cold air carrying the first real edge of the coming winter. "The cafe," Damien said. She looked at him. "You've been thinking about it," he said. "The diner space. What you'd do with it if you owned it instead of worked in it." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Dennis mentioned it when my investigator spoke with him." "Your investigator spoke with Dennis?" "Briefly. He mentioned that you'd talked about it once." He looked at the yard. "I own the building the diner is in. I bought it through one of the facades 2 years ago when the previous owner needed liquidity. I didn't know you were there when I bought it." He paused. "I'm going to sign it over to you, the building. Clean title, no encumbrance, no conditions." She was very still. "You can do what you want with it," he said. "Close the diner, change it, sell the building, whatever you decide. It's yours." He looked at her. "It's not a payment, and it's not an apology. It's a piece of property that should belong to you." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the specific arithmetic she'd been doing for 7 years. The bills, the shifts, the $5 for a rain jacket, the calculation that never quite cleared. She thought about what it would mean to do that arithmetic from a different starting position. She thought about what it cost to accept something. "Conditions," she said. "You said no conditions." "No conditions." "Then I'll think about it," she said. He nodded once and looked back at the yard. After a while, Noah stood up and left the dog in the grass and walked across the yard toward the steps. He walked the way he always walked, direct, unhurried, with the quality of intention that made adults step back slightly when they saw him coming. He came to the bottom step and stood there and looked at Damien. Damien looked back at him. 7 years of a closed room. 8 years of intercepted letters. The Pacific Ocean and a stolen photograph and a name said in a lamp room and the long, slow morning after. It was a lot to lay at the feet of a 7-year-old with a dinosaur backpack and a fish book, and neither of them was going to do that. Noah said, "Your face looks bad." "I know," Damien said. "Mara said you got hit." "Twice, technically." Noah considered this with the seriousness he brought to structural problems. "Did you hit back?" "Yes." "Okay," Noah said, and sat down on the bottom step and looked at the yard, and Biscuit lumbered over and put his head on Noah's knee again, and the three of them sat in the gray afternoon in the back of a house inland from the Oregon coast, and the silence between them was not empty. The federal process took 4 months. There were lawyers and documents and conversations in rooms that Mara was not present for, and conversations in rooms that she was, and there were days when the whole machinery of it felt like it would never resolve into anything clean. It didn't resolve cleanly, it resolved sufficiently, which was a different thing. And she'd come to understand that sufficient resolution was what you got when the situation had been too complicated for too long to permit anything clean. Hargrove entered a federal facility in January. Webb's cooperation, which had been extensive and continued to be, resulted in an arrangement that kept him out of a cell but ended any possibility of him being anything other than what he now was, a man who had spent his leverage and had nothing left. The parallel infrastructure of Colvin's old network was dismantled piece by piece, which was unglamorous work and took longer than anyone wanted, and Damien spent most of those 4 months not on the Oregon coast but moving between London and Washington and the specific geography of unwinding a thing that had taken years to build. He called twice a week, always at 7 in the evening, Oregon time, always on the same number, and when Noah was still up, he talked to both of them, and when Noah was asleep, he talked to Mara, and the conversations were not romantic and were not yet entirely comfortable, but they were honest in the way that things become honest when the alternative has already shown you what it costs. He visited in February, stayed 4 days. He and Noah went to the harbor together on the second day. Mara watched them from the diner window, the tall man and the boy walking the dock in the cold, Noah pointing at things and talking, Damien listening with the quality of attention she'd come to recognize as his version of warmth. The care of a person who didn't express care easily, and so expressed it through complete presence. She watched them for a long time. On the third day, Noah asked him, with no preamble, why he didn't live here. Damien had looked at him for a moment and then said that he'd been away for a long time doing things he needed to stop doing, and that stopping them was taking longer than he'd like. Noah had thought about this. "Are you going to stop?" he'd said. "Yes," Damien had said. "Okay," Noah had said, and that had been the end of it, because 7-year-olds, certain 7-year-olds, understood instinctively which answers were complete and which weren't, and that one had been complete. The diner became a cafe in March. Mara kept Dennis on. He managed the kitchen, which he'd been doing effectively for 15 years, and showed no inclination to stop. She changed the counter and repainted the walls and replaced the sign. She kept the view, such as it was, the parking lot, the bait shop, the strip of harbor visible past the edge of the building, the gray Oregon water beyond. She kept the corner booth, the one with the cracked vinyl and the children's names scratched into the table edge, because Noah ate there every afternoon after school with his homework and his library books, and she wasn't going to change that. She kept the 4th and 7th stair, which still creaked because some alarms were worth keeping. The cafe did well. Not dramatically well. This was the Oregon coast in the shoulder season. This was a harbor town. But well enough. And well enough from a starting position of ownership was a different arithmetic entirely than well enough from a starting position of counting shifts. She was running the morning prep in late April, the cafe not yet open, the harbor light coming through the windows in the flat gray way that had been her backdrop for 7 years, when she heard the downstairs door. Not a knock. A key. She'd given him a key in February with the particular casualness of someone trying not to make a thing of it, sliding it across the kitchen table one morning with her eyes on her coffee, and he'd picked it up without making a thing of it either, and she'd understood that this was how it was going to work between them. Not dramatically, not with the architecture of declarations, but in the small and practical and irreversible steps that two people take when they've decided to stop treating each other as temporary. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. 4th step, 7th step. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was wearing the jacket she'd decided was her favorite of his, the worn one, the one that had been through enough to stop trying to look like anything. He had coffee from somewhere down the road. 2 cups, held carefully, the specific care of someone who has learned what another person takes in their coffee and treats that knowledge with appropriate seriousness. He held one out. She took it. They stood in the kitchen of her cafe in the gray April morning and drank their coffee and listened to the harbor doing what it always did. The water moving, the boats shifting against their lines, the birds, the wind coming off the Pacific in the long, steady way that it had been coming off the Pacific long before any of them were here and would be long after. "Noah's alarm goes off in 20 minutes, she said. "I know." She looked at him. The jaw had healed, the bruise long gone, the cut a small scar she'd stopped noticing. He looked like himself, which she was only now beginning to understand was a thing she knew, the specific and complicated self of this specific and complicated man. Not the version she'd carried for 8 years, but the real version, the one with the weight of the actual life in it. "He wants to show you the tide pools," she said. "He's been planning it. He has a list." "What kind of list?" "The species he expects to find, ranked by his personal interest level. Annotated." She looked at her coffee. "He made it in the margin of his math worksheet." Damien was quiet for a moment. She looked at him and saw what she'd learned to look for. The thing that lived underneath the controlled surface, the thing he didn't perform, didn't announce, the thing that was just there when he looked at Noah, or talked about him, or listened to her talk about him. It didn't have a simple name. It was the feeling of a room reopened after a very long time, and the specific quality of the air inside it. "Tell him I'm ready," Damien said. She nodded. She looked out the cafe window at the harbor. A fishing boat was moving out through the channel, running lights still on in the pre-dawn gray, heading for the open water. She watched it go and thought about the shoebox full of letters, and the boots on iron stairs and the name spoken in a cold lamp room, and the long road from all of that to this kitchen, this coffee, this ordinary and irreplaceable morning. The road had cost things that couldn't be returned. 8 years. The version of herself that would have been a forensic accountant in a different city. The years of Noah's life that had been shaped by an absence neither of them had chosen. Those costs were real, and they were permanent, and she was done pretending they weren't. But she was also here. In a place she had built. With a son who was going to come down those stairs in 20 minutes with a tide pool list in his dinosaur backpack and drag them both to the water's edge to look at things that were small and tenacious and had learned to survive in the gap between the tides. She finished her coffee. "Go wake him up," she said. "He sleeps through his alarm." Damien set his cup on the counter. He crossed the kitchen and she heard the 4th step, the 7th step, and then the soft knock on Noah's door and the low sound of his voice, and the specific drowsy protest of a boy being woken, and then silence as Noah understood who had woken him, and then the sound that came after, not words, just the sound of a door opening wide. She stood at the window and looked at the harbor in the gray April light, the water doing what it always did, permanent and indifferent, and somehow this morning not indifferent at all, just present, the way the best things are. Outside, the fishing boat had cleared the channel and turned toward the open water, heading into the wide gray Pacific, growing small with distance, and then smaller, and then gone.